Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Getting Strategic, Lessons from 3 Decades of ECM Experience. I'm Teresa Resick, Director of Webinars here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. With me today are AIIM's Chief Evangelist, John Mancini, an awesome panel of IT experts sharing their work's experiences, along with IBM's David Jeunesse. IBM is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. Just as we get started, just want to offer a few pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience, so feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows. Across the bottom of your screen is the list of widgets available to you. Group chat is available to you, and you do need to open this. It's not already open on your desktop. So just click on the widget that's in the list at the bottom for group chat, and you'll be able to join the conversation. Chat with a few of us here at AIIM, and certainly you'll be able to chat with each other because everybody will all be, all of your comments will be visible to everyone who's participating. You ask questions of the speakers throughout the hour using the Q&A feature, and that's to the left side of your screen. We will hold these until the end, where we should have about 5 or 10 minutes to answer them. You can also use this feature to ask for technical assistance. You can download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list that's to the right of the slide area. There are also a few other documents and links in there to help you learn more about today's topic. So just click in there at any time, and those resources will open in a new browser tab for you, and you can just save them off and read them after the webinar. And at the end of this webinar, a brief survey is going to open in your browser, and we'd appreciate it if you take a few moments, offer your feedback, and to suggest other topics for us to cover. You can also access this survey from that list of widgets across the bottom of your screen. And as always, our webinars are being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. Now, right now, I'm just going to introduce our facilitator that we have with us today. John Mancini is the Chief Evangelist and past President of AIIM. He's a well-known author and speaker on information management and digital transformation. He's also a frequent keynote speaker, and he offers his expertise on digital transformation and the struggle to overcome information chaos. He blogs under the title Digital Landfill and has published more than 15 ebooks. So right now, I'm going to turn things over to John so that he can introduce the panelists that he brought with him today. John?
Great. Thank you, Teresa. And hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today. I thought before allowing each of the panelists to introduce themselves, I'd give you a little bit of context for why I thought this might be a fun thing to do. This is going to be a little bit different than the normal webinar. As we get into it, you'll find that almost all the slides are just a couple of picture thematic slides. So it's not a traditional webinar presentation in that, we've got 35 slides and we're going to run through all the bullets and we're going to talk through all of it. The background for this was that I was at an IBM user group meeting in New York, and I was moderating a panel with these guys, and it was basically on the future of ECM. And how organizations are perceiving ECM moving forward. And the context for that, on a personal level, I think we've all seen a lot of the materials that have been out in the marketplace, including from AIIM, talking about the ECM term and talking about where is it going, everything from Gartner talking about ECM being dead to Forrester splitting the market into transactional content services and business content services. And so the panel for me, when we did it, was really refreshing. And I hope that we'll be able to convey some of that refreshingness, if you will, in a webinar, because it's a little hard when you can't see people. But what I found refreshing was that we had folks that had extensive experience in ECM. And you can make the argument, as we have, that maybe the ECM term is no longer sufficient to really describe what it is that people are actually doing with content. And I think that's true. But I think it's not sufficient from the perspective that content's even more important than it traditionally has been and more ubiquitous in organizations. And so I found the experience of these folks, I found the energy and the excitement that they had for content management really refreshing at a particular point in time for me. So that's why I thought it might be fun to try and replicate this on a webinar, and one that has very modest and not very many slides. So it'll be very conversational in nature. So I'd like to encourage all of you all to be part of the conversation. As Teresa said, there is a question tab, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible after we tee up 5 or 6 conversational topics that I wanted to cover with these folks. And so I would encourage you to submit some questions. And so without further ado, let me allow each of these folks, going from left to right on the slide, to give a little personal introduction in terms of their personal engagement with ECM over the years, and just to give you kind of a little bit of a sense of the depth of experience that we have here. So we'll start with George, and you have the meme here, it looks like, of the Statue of Liberty. So why don't you start?
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. As far as ECM, I've been doing it for about 20 years. If you want to go way back in the past, I started this with Martin Chalk and Watermark, and then found myself moving to FileNet when FileNet bought out Watermark, and eventually we ended up in the P8 environment. As to why ECM, as we go through this conversation, it is the most strategic and powerful technology you can ever deliver to users.
Jenson, give us a little bit of your background.
Thanks a lot, John. This is Jenson Jacob. I'm basically a colleague of George too, with New York State Information Technology Services. I am a critical partner. I would say, if you look at the slides, George is our service delivery guy, and I'm the architect or the enterprise guy that is basically making sure that the economy of ECM runs efficiently in ITS. So I'm pretty much excited to be part of this esteemed panel and look forward to participating. Thank you.
And Paul, it looks like you're in the official uniform of the FileNet user group, so why don't you introduce yourself?
Why, thank you, John. It's wonderful to be back. Yes, I've been involved with FileNet since the FDOS days in 1990, and have been doing image services ever since then, and am now transitioning into the P8 platform.
Great. So I think you got a sense, and if you didn't, collectively, these folks represent, kind of 30-plus years of experience with all the various nuances of content management, and their organizations have been involved in it for just about the same period of time. And so what I wanted to do was start with an organizational perspective, and maybe start with George a bit. And what you have going on, what I'd like to accomplish in this little conversation, and this is the piece that I thought was really impressive when we had the panel in New York, was just the scale of these implementations and the depth of these implementations, and maybe start with George, and then go to Paul, and then Jenson, maybe you could talk a little bit about it from more of a technical perspective. So George, why don't you give a little bit of a sense of your implementation?
Well, New York State has invested heavily into ECM, and we're at the point right now where we are hosting 4.7 billion pages. We're supporting 116,000 users. We have somewhere around 75 current apps and 25 in the queue. We're ingesting 100 million pages a quarter, and currently we have 92 terabytes of storage. But we're only in 14 of 57 agencies, so we're just starting.
Wow. That was 4.7 billion with a B, right?
Correct.
Okay. Paul, talk a little bit about your organization.
Well, I can't hold a candle, of course, to the state of New York, but I work for a hospital here in the city. We've got about 1 billion pages of patient records that go all the way back to 1989, and we do about 25 million documents a year, and it's been interesting to watch how that number has continued to grow. The world of ECM is continuing to excite the medical community, and I think that we've got a lot to look forward to in the future.
And Jenson, on your side, is there anything from kind of a technical infrastructure perspective you want to give a flavor for in terms of the New York State implementation?
Absolutely. So I think George spoke about the scale of the volume and the metrics, and one of the things that we as a challenge is basically how to basically support this huge constituent. So New York State went through a large transformation 3 years back. Probably many of you guys don't know, but we basically did a merger and acquisition of more than 50 plus agencies, consolidated all the IT division. And what we're going through is one of our largest implementations, at least in state government that I know of, where George talked about 14. I think we're going to support more than 50 plus agencies in terms of the ECM scale, covering all the IBM FileNet stack. So we're looking at a scale of trying to support as big as a company like IBM doing in a cloud or any other company in the cloud, where we're saying we have built our own private cloud in this New York State's data center. So our capability to support this kind of huge momentum, and we're just growing, is one of the largest services that is part of our enterprise services. So ECM is a very strategic enterprise service that we are targeting, and we are going at a momentous pace. And one of the things that we are working very heavily is to transform all our legacy customers that used to be in the old FileNet P8. As you know, as New York State, we own many versions of FileNet. Right now, we are converting everything into one single FileNet P8 version and bringing them closer to a shared truth.
So maybe for any of you, if you could give me a sense of, you can get the sense that ECM is a very strategic technology for you. Give me a sense of, another, say, 2 or 3 complementary technologies that are also part of this equation for you. Do you have other ECM platforms, or is FileNet the main one, or just give me a sense of maybe what else goes on in the organization, just to give a flavor for the complexity of the implementation?
Well, when we started consolidating the IT functions into one agency, we found between 8 and 12 different ECM product sets of anything you can think of. It was deployed somewhere. So what you end up with is having to have skills for all of those, and some of these were not scalable, and you have no patterns of success. So the state picked the P8 platform as the standard, and everything is moving to it. So we're talking about the size of the operation, and we're doing it with probably 25 people.
Yeah, that decision to rationalize and consolidate is interesting, because our data, just given the way that ECM evolved over the years, 52% of organizations, when we do surveys, they basically said they have at least 3 ECM systems. 22% say they have at least 5 ECM systems. And so that complexity gets, kind of magnified when you start to take implementations from one department and try to move them into multiple departments.
And then when you do the permutations of how they differ on operating systems and databases, it's just chaotic, and Jenson can chime in on that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that, as George said, we realize what I normally say, we have a talk internally, we say we are the Amazon of ECM. We own IBM, Documentum, OpenText, Alfresco, you name it in the Gartner quadrant or the Forrester, we own it. So it was simply impossible to sustain that model when we did the IT transformation 4 years back. So it was a very strategic and a very clever decision from the state to basically put forward the journey on one standard pattern, so that, the service delivery team led by George and, from an enterprise perspective, we can concentrate on the success rate of the customer. So I would say it was a decision that basically drifted us apart from all other services in the state.
And Paul, in your organization, other key platforms that are part of your solution that you deliver?
Well, actually, we've got quite a few, but I think I want to echo George's point and just amplify one little bit of it, and that is that the advantage of the pain and anguish of making the decision to consolidate into a single platform is significant, and not the least of which is that you end up with a core competency of people who are very skilled in that rather than a diluted set of competencies across numerous different platforms. It's also essential to the idea of shared services and the idea of bringing all of it under one roof and under one set of responsibilities and disaster recovery and backups and everything like that.
So let me switch gears a little bit. And one of the things that we talked about in New York is, when content management goes from a nice to have, or when it goes from, say, being just a single departmental solution to becoming a core underlying technology for multiple key mission-critical solutions and processes, you got a situation where content systems basically can never go down. And one of the data points in our recent survey that really struck me was that 45% of the organizations that we surveyed said that their organization, not their department and not individual people, but their organization would suffer a serious disruption within an hour if a content management system went down. So maybe starting with Paul, talk about that idea of how mission criticality changes as content management becomes more and more a key part of the organization.
Well, it really is. I mean, you begin to rely on it in ways that you hadn't relied on before, and there is always this fallacy, this kind of almost fantasy of paper that, oh, no worries, if the system goes down, we can revert back to paper for the period of time that the system is down, and then we'll just have a little bit of extra work once the system comes back up in order to ingest all of that paper. And that really doesn't work. And one of the reasons why it doesn't work is as you move farther and farther away from your go-live date, the skill sets involved in using the paper diminish. And as you hire new people, they have none of the experience of using the paper. So when the system goes down, you have no paper to rely on. You have no ability to go back because your staff is no longer skilled in that use. So you really have to put all of your eggs, so to speak, into a basket that you have taken very careful care of and have skilled and very trustworthy people working on. And where we are right now is we're in a particularly good place. My system has averaged each year about an hour of unscheduled downtime per year. And when we're supporting a set of doctors that are making patient care decisions, that is really the only level of agreement that you can have. You have to be up that much.
Wow, that's really interesting. Jenson, talk a little bit. You were probably the guy who gets the phone calls when systems do go down. So talk about your uptime, downtime, kind of that redundancy question that you undoubtedly are charged with.
Oh, yes. I mean, we talked about the scale, and George talked about the consolidation. So think about like what I just said. 4 years back, we were all siloed agencies within New York State. Every agency had their own ECM team, their own servers, their own PH system. We now merged them into one single system. So now that mission critical is not just for one agency, it's multiple agencies, each in a different business domain. So for us, going down is not an option because now we may get tax compliance, or public safety, health and human services, DMV system. So for us, it's basically showing the difference in how we maintain our enterprise services and isolating it so that we are critical. So one of the things we in New York State did is, and probably many of you guys on the webinar would know that it's always like, hey, it works in dev but doesn't work in prod. It works in QA, it doesn't work in prod. So what we decided is like, why don't we make a difference and say let all our environments look similar? So what we did in New York State for ECM is that our lab environment, dev environment, or a QA environment, or a performance and our production all look the same. The security configurations look the same, the setup looks the same, the security template looks the same. So for us to mimic an issue a customer brings in is basically an easy service because we can mimic it anywhere. So I would say being consolidated means we have to be behave like a security operations center or a network operations center for the entire state, because for us, going down is not an option.
It's interesting. It kind of reminds me a little bit of, when you fly Southwest and they always fly the same airplane no matter what, so that parts are always available and kind of all that stuff. That interchangeability and of experience, I think, is really important. George, did you have anything you wanted to chime in on that never go down thing? How much downtime have you guys had over, say, the last, 5 years, 6 years, something like that?
My team, we run the current environment. Our components have been 100% production uptime for almost 3 years. So we have not missed a minute.
So without interruption.
Right. On the pieces that we're responsible for. There's another part that we need to talk about as far as content management. People got to remember, content is knowledge. Content is 70% of an organization's knowledge and information. Once you begin to digitize it, the speed that people can then access their information, their knowledge, and then drive processes is phenomenal. There is no going back. You burn your boats on the beach. You can't go back to paper. So you just have to.
That's an interesting compliment to what Paul said, which is, you don't usually think of it that way, but once you kind of go past a certain point.
No, once you start, you don't go back.
There is no return.
Using AIIM standards. I mean, I can retrieve anything in our repositories in 10 seconds, but if it's paper, it's typically 20 minutes unless you can't find it, and then it's 6 hours to recreate it. All that is eliminated. So the velocity that we bring to applications is just phenomenal. And the other part that people have to remember is, again, I'm in government, so you go to government sites. Processes are dominated by the smell and sound of paper. And once you've digitized them, that's all gone. It's just click and pop.
Cool, very cool. That's a good jumping off point to this question of scale. And, maybe start with Paul. Your scale is a little bit more modest than George's, so we'll let you go first. But in either case, this is pretty massive scale you guys are talking about. And talk a little bit about how the whole nature, you've been doing this a long time, how the nature of the experience changes as that scale becomes massive.
Well, it has a couple of significant impacts. One is, of course, that if you make a mistake, especially in the taxonomy, it is replicated all over the place. And so you have to be a little more careful with the design of your documents, especially when you're creating 1 million or 2 million of them a month. The other thing is that regardless of how good your platform is today, the expectation is that at some point soon there's going to be a new version of it that comes out, and eventually those versions require a migration. So a migration takes time, and that time seems to go up not necessarily linearly, which is kind of surprising to me. So we're looking at a 3 to 4 year migration effort just for my 1 billion pages of patient medical records. So planning that out is a real doozy, mainly because by the time I get it in, it's almost time to start thinking about the next upgrade. Like the poor guy who's
painting the Golden Gate Bridge or something.
That's exactly it. By the time you get to the far end, it's time to turn around and start painting again.
George, how about on your side? Talk about your I think 4.7 billion. You said. Talk about that scale.
You need to double check, triple check before you do anything. I started in construction. You measure twice, 3, 5 times, and then you cut. Because if you make a mistake, you're going to impact tens of thousands of users in their production time, and I never want to report that to my management. So you just have to be, you need to be cautious, but you need to be aggressive because you just have to stay current. 4 years for an upgrade. There's a lot of us would kind of like that, Paul. But anyhow, we're upgrading systems that are 20 plus years old. It's very painful.
And Jenson, that George's point, kind of, maybe that dovetails back to that consistent development and production environment. That in order to be able to do that and avoid those things that George was talking about, is that one of the reasons why you went down that path?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you gave your example, we talked about consistent configuration, one standard configuration. So if you look at people in the cloud market, if you look at all the verticals and the horizontals, everybody wants one standard configuration. Gone are the days where, I use the theory that what we use in our office, we say cattle and pets. Everybody used to have their own pets. I want to do it this way. I want to scan it this way. So we have to bring it to the cattle mode where everything looks the same. So from my perspective, we can't afford to have pets in ECM. We all have to look like a cattle because that is the only way we can meet the challenge of an uptime. So from New York State perspective, since we have consolidated, we have to support from a compliance perspective multiple protocols, right? We're looking at HIPAA, we're looking at PUP 1075, FTI. So one of the things that we said is like, I'm not going to take a chance of handling a security question or a compliance question for one particular customer. So we said we're going to encrypt everything in transit and rest. So we made it available from a security perspective. Let's start building common configurations all the way from the top, from George's delivery team to the implementation. So consistency is the only way that you can meet this massive scale challenges. No more pets, only cattle.
I hadn't used that. I'm going to have to remember that for a presentation. I like that. Paul, talk a little bit about your experiences in this regard. Do you have a consistent development in production environment like Jenson's talking about?
Yeah, we haven't had the same level of success with that. We, like a lot of places, started with a number of siloed applications and business units. And while we have brought many of them under the single umbrella, the level of uniqueness with them and the amount of configuration that each business unit has mandated has meant that we don't have an awful lot of consistency across them. Whether it's the security requirements, whether it's the workflows and the way that they do business, it seems to be significantly different from business unit to business unit. So we haven't enjoyed the same success.
So what I want to talk about now, and I want to make sure this comes across because it was, I thought, pretty interesting in the in-person panel that we did, is this idea of getting beyond single-purpose ECM implementations and viewing ECM as a shared service. And actually, that probably even funnels eventually back into what Gartner's talking about in terms of content services. But this idea that this is a shared service that that evolves over time and becomes a core part of many processes in the organization. And George, when we were talking, and I should know this, but I didn't know it, how unusual New York is in terms of the approach that you take to the agencies in terms of IT infrastructure. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and then talk about how ECM fits into that.
Well, as far as ECM, we're bringing it up as a shared service. The economics of ECM are such that once you put in a platform, the cost of an additional application is just incremental. It's the cost of additional storage. It's the cost of additional licenses. But other than that, you just can't do one-offs for every ECM app. The economics just prohibit it, and you couldn't even get the staff trained to support all of it. I mean, when we aggregate everything we've done for the last year for ECM as a shared service, our delivered value to the state and our agencies is $124 million.
124 million.
Million, yes.
And how did you guys come to that conclusion?
Well, we walked it right through. We did 400 million pages ingested last year. So that saves $875,000 in paper. And you never think about it, but that saved $3 million in toner. And then as you keep extrapolating, you asked for this, John.
Yeah.
Suddenly you have almost 2 acres of land of storage you don't need. So that saves $7.5 million, and you're not buying 14,000 file cabinets, so that saves another $4 million. And by the way, you don't need over 1,000 people to file and retrieve paper documents. So when you aggregate that all together, that comes up to $124 million. And that's only because we're only in 14 agencies. We got a whole lot to go yet.
Do most states have a different approach to IT than New York State in terms of...
I have no idea. I'll let somebody else answer that.
I think that's the case, that in many states they don't have a common IT infrastructure and shared services strategy, and so each agency is kind of free to do its own thing. And I was impressed at even though you say you're only in 14 agencies, the commitment is obviously there to deliver IT in a different kind of way than is typical, and in a more economical way. I'll talk a little bit about your organization and and like how you take content and content management capabilities and basically sell it to the business. How do you get them to buy projects and to invest in projects?
Well, one of the ways that we've managed to bring on a few of them, at least recently, is to go into the smaller shops that have not had any kind of real ECM, but they've had enough local skill in order to create a series of shared directories. Really is what we found tends to be the way that they do it, where they'll using just Windows Explorer, they'll be saving all of their content layer upon layer upon layer. And there's an enormous amount of local knowledge as to where things are stored. But when Louise or Joe go on vacation, that knowledge goes on vacation with them. And so what we've been able to do is pull a number of these smaller business units off of Microsoft Windows. These weren't even in SharePoint; they were just shared drives, and pull them into a common into the common PA system.
Jenson, this whole commitment to shared services on the part of the state has to have a real significant implication for how you deliver IT there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think New York State would not survive without having a shared service approach, because as I said, you have to understand that not all agencies or not all organizations have the funding, the resource, the skill set to basically provide the same capability as an agency that has the resources. So one of the things that shared services does is it opens up the avenue for those agencies and applications that do not have heard of ECM, because they will say, what is ECM? I have no idea. Is it a file being stored in a folder? So from my perspective, shared service is the only way, and ECM is only one of them, from terms of identity, security, in terms of our data center services. We are constantly trying in New York State to basically identify new shared services to sell to our business constituents, because it is actually impossible to do it yourself, even if you were practically non-transformed. So the selling and the delivery is basically very important. And shared services, if it fails, it basically puts I would say, a gap in the implementation path. So for George to sell is much easier if that capability exists. So this is why, as part of the delivery approach, we have multiple services, and a customer can choose between just having a business repository to having a case management system to a capture system. So the options are many, and we get a regular feedback from our delivery team that engages with the customer to come back and say, what net new services would the state want to deliver to their constituents? So it's a good loop back mechanism to come back and give them the options.
And that's a good hopping off point to what I wanted to talk about next, which is this whole question of skills. And, coming from an AIM environment, and, we've always been involved in helping people get the skills they need in order to do this stuff effectively. It strikes me that you guys have an interesting vantage point on this question of the evolution of skills over time, because you've started this back in a pretty early stage, and I can't help but think that the skills that you are looking for and that you need have to have changed since you first started. And so maybe, Paul, you could start with that and just talk about this question of what kinds of people do you need? What kinds of skills do they need to have? Is this a difficult thing for you guys? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's changed significantly in the years since I graduated from college and started in this business in 1984. When I began, it was all batch COBOL and things like that, and people had 5, 6, 7, 8 years of consistent experience with a single platform and a single language. What I'm finding today is that there are so many different languages available and so many different plugins and technologies that the employees are coming to us with, that I'm just not convinced that there is that depth of knowledge and that real ability to hone their craft on a set of tools before those tools age out and the next new thing comes up over the horizon and everyone leaps for it. So that's my biggest worry is this idea that training, I'm not entirely sure is entirely up to scratch, especially compared to where it was in years past. So that's something that I certainly look forward to an improvement on. But I think it's really the speed of change and the ability of all of us to be competent in the tools before they're obsolete.
That's really interesting. How about on the New York State side? Either Jenson or George, who wants to go first? Just talk about that skills question.
Go ahead, George.
I mean, you're always going to have to change your skills. That comes with the deal. We're moving people off of Windows servers and tightly coupled applications into today's API EA environment, and people are going through pain. It really is. People have to just keep moving. They can't calcify. Skills, my big need for skills are technical. I need the soft skills. I need the BAs. I need the PMs. Those are critical to talk to users so they can understand how to incorporate ECM into their environment.
How do you keep current, George?
We all go home and read manuals all night long. and read AIM articles all day long.
Oh, well, good. My life is fulfilled, I guess. So that's a good thing.
So John, let me take a stab on the technical aspect on this one.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
So you would wonder, basically, when we talk here, we're talking about 5 environments from a New York State shared service perspective, and then you'll think about, I would say roughly we have around 140 plus servers totally for this environment. And you would think, to manage 140 servers, I need a big team of 20. We manage it with 4 people. And how do you do that? I think the most important skill set that organizations need to is to find people who have the base ECM skills in understanding how ECM conceptually works. We think in a way that if you know the fundamental conceptual architecture, then figure out the skill set that you need to maintain your operational model. So from my perspective, if you have to maintain one standard consistent configuration, the skill sets to learn that single configuration is much easier than trying to figure out the different pets, because I think many organizations have different resources knowing different skill sets. Once you come to the middle as a standard configuration, managing those operational skills, those information management skills become much easier, because now everybody speaks the same language, like a UML or like a standard language like a BPM, and because now you want to make ECM as a standard language that everybody can understand. So fewer people with good skills meeting in the middle. That's my mantra.
Yeah, very, very cool. Very cool. Okay, we're almost at my last question here, and then we're going to start to open it up. So there's a lot of good questions here from the audience I want to cover, but I want to spend a little time and talk about the future. What comes next for you guys? I think one of the things that I found somewhat inspiring when I listened to you guys is that you clearly have been on a long journey, but you clearly have a sense that this journey is by no means complete, and you're doing a lot of really interesting things with regards to pushing the technology. And maybe I'll start with Paul. And you told a story that I found very interesting. It's kind of along these lines, but you were talking about the challenges of utilizing analytics technologies, and particularly cognitive technologies, to understand what actually is in a 100 DPI TIFF that you stored 25 years ago. And maybe just talk about that question of applying new technologies to get more value out of what you've already invested in.
And that's a key point. So one of the things that has changed over the years, of course, is the cost of storage. And a long time ago, storage was exceptionally expensive, and so choices were made because of the cost of the storage in order to reduce that cost. And one of the ways we did it was by reducing the dots per inch, the DPI, that documents were scanned at. So quite a few, I'm going to say 75 to 80% of our legacy documents are all scanned at 100 DPI, and we're running into difficulties with the various cognitive tools, including Watson, in being able to read those. And I remain 100% confident that the smart folks at IBM are going to be able to figure this out. And I say that because I can hand a 100 DPI document to my 9-year-old, and he can read it. He can read it with no trouble whatsoever. And so I am absolutely certain that as the technology to read this improves, that we're going to be able to go back farther and farther in time and cognitively read these older documents that are currently eluding us and are still dark.
George, talk a little bit about where you guys are trying to go next. You have a rich investment and a very visionary view. Where do you see this evolving in the next couple years?
The goal has always been to turn content into knowledge. And we're just finally getting to the point between shared services and low incremental costs that we can start beginning to really look at the content and try to turn it into knowledge, start to talk about knowledge architectures, and talk about information flow across organizations and how to facilitate that. The biggest issue we're still fighting is, for all the investment IT does, it still treats ECM as the redheaded stepchild, when given that we're 70% of the knowledge and information, we should be the front of the line and we should be getting all the investment. It's one of the craziness of our industry. Most of the knowledge is not being managed. So that's always been the goal, and we've spent all this time just getting ready to launch.
Jenson, on a technical side, given the rapid nature of all the changes that are going on right now on the technology side, where do you see this headed?
That's a very loaded question because I will tell you one thing. One of the things that we have been asked from the last 2 years, and I think probably George knows about it too, now that we have all this wealth of unstructured content, and we do have the capability within the state to not only have ECM unstructured content, there are a lot of non-ECM unstructured content. So one of the things that we are looking from an enterprise service perspective is how do we prove innovation and value add to the business folks about their own data, because many of the times, many of these ECM apps are considered as siloed applications. They're only looking at it from their line of business activity. They don't go across their agencies or across their departmental. So one of the things we will actively do is with the right security and the compliance, because data security and data compliance becomes a key issue in a big data world from a privacy perspective. So we are going to look at using some of the cognitive analytics features that the state has invested in trying to see some value adds that we can probably display or mirror to the users, because we have to you cannot have the analytics being spruced upon the users. We have to show them the value add from their initial line of business and then go across the silos. So I think the technology exists. It's the selling part that we have to do a good job in the state. So I think we are just on the cusp of it.
Well, I wanted to take the liberty here. Actually, this slide that I put up, actually in violation of my all pictures slide, I did this slide after we were together in person, and I wanted to see if we would kind of come back to some of the same points. So let me just cover these and then offer each of you an opportunity just to comment on what I've kind of concluded here. The first one, which I think, George, you talked about, and I gave it a name, so I've often thought that, the key, like Moore's Law and stuff, this is Warner's Rule. We're going to try to make you famous, George, is that you can't digitize an app, a process, or an organization if 70% of the organization's knowledge crawls at the speed of paper. Kind of point one, and I'm glad you re-emphasized that again today. Second one is this idea that even at massive scale, you can't stand still, and that was one of the pieces I think that I thought was most interesting. This shared services approach, and I'm not even completely sure we did it total justice today, but this idea that, this traditional idea of ECM, which is that, what you're doing with content management is solving a single mission-critical, document-intensive business process problem, is not really where you want to go with this. You want to create a set of capabilities that can be extended and leveraged throughout the organization with other IT capabilities. And then the last thing, which I think was really clear from what you guys were saying, is that you view this as a strategic technology, far bit from being, even though it's hard sometimes to get attention from IT, mainly because this is a different kind of a discipline than traditional IT, but is nonetheless a strategic technology. So is there anything here that you guys would take umbrage with in terms of what I wrote down after the last time we were together, or anything that you want to add to this little list here that I might have missed that you want to make sure people know?
Just everybody needs to keep in mind that ECM is a technological solution to a business problem. So in order to make this opportunity work, you need to know your numbers. You need to know the cost of the current process. You need to know how ECM can make it faster, cheaper, smarter, and have numbers to defend. And then it will start to ripple. Then suddenly you're going to find yourself with 75 applications with another 25 coming on board.
Jenson, how about you? Anything that you wanted to make sure that we that people understood from the environment of being kind of the technical side of this?
I would say that I've embraced the internet model. The reason why the cloud works and it's basically growing at a rapid pace is because of consistency and having one standard configuration. So in addition to all the points here, I think there's one impact. You can give value add to your customers if you are consistent, you are standard, and you have one single language to speak to your customers, right from your technical aspect to your business aspect. So for me, consistency is the most important strategy for New York State.
Interesting. Paul, how about you?
One of the biggest surprises for me over the past couple of years as we started exploring the strategic side of it and truly the really enterprise side of it was the taxonomy and the amount of effort that went into developing the taxonomy, especially as it started going across business lines. And the final shocker for us was that you can't go back afterwards and layer security on top of an existing taxonomy. You're far, far better off thinking about security as part of the taxonomy as you are designing the way your data looks. So think of security as part of the data rather than something that's imposed on top of the data by some outside group like information security.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll be back to some questions in just a sec. And before then, since IBM was the underwriter for this webinar, I wanted to give David Janess a chance to just go through a couple of things. And David, you've been so uncharacteristically quiet, I almost kind of forgot you were there. So why don't you, I'll hand the microphone over to you, and then we'll come back for some questions in just a minute or two.
Well, thank you, John. This has been a great discussion, and on behalf of IBM, I'm really happy to say that we're pleased to support this kind of discussion because it benefits all of us in information management, whether you use IBM or not. So I was looking for a visual representation of what I hear this esteemed panel saying, and I think that when you look at all the initiatives that organizations are investing in, the point is clear that if you don't have the content piece, then your information management strategy is incomplete. So this is something that I'm hearing George say very clearly. This is 70% of your knowledge. And in fact, he advocates to start with content when you start to plan your business applications. And so I thought, well, call it whatever you like, ECM or content services. I'm going to call it big content. And it's really a mindset more than anything. Big content is where you start with content before you build out your apps. And you can see in the inner circle here, you would have content-centric applications where document management or records management or case management. You've got the governance that you need, and you're able to capture and bring in paper and other forms of electronic documents and get it all under management. And that's really your digital transformation. A lot of organizations are still doing this. But what's really interesting is the outer circle here. So customer communications management. I mean, that's very content-centric. It's all about creating content and sharing it with customers. Look at blockchain. I mean, blockchain is certainly a transactional standard, but think of all of the documents that go along with containers that are being shipped all around the world. That's like 20% of the cost and the effort in shipping. And so the content is woven into these. Look at robotics process. If you're not supplying accurate, real content to the robots, so data capture is a really good front end to robotics. And any digital business application you're trying to build is all about engaging with customers. Well, where did you get that information, that understanding of the customer? You got it from the content and all of the stuff that they've been supplying. So I think this really does support George's notion that start with content, and it is woven into so many different things. And so lastly, I would be remiss if I did not make sure the audience understood that if you keep that big content mindset, then we see the portfolio that IBM has put together, the content services platform, and you can read about it by clicking on this link, and that'll take you to our leading web page. But here you can see there's platforms and services here that can help you manage the statements and invoices you create internally, multi-channel capture for incoming content, cloud collaboration for working on and creating content, case management for activating content in a business process, and content analytics for cognitive search and for insight and mining of content. And it all sits on the content management platforms. We've heard P8 mentioned a few times, and that's a shorthand for IBM FileNet Content Manager. IBM has a couple of platforms, but that's underpinning all of this. And of course, across the top, one of the things IBM did 3 or 4 years ago is introduce a user interface application framework that connects all of them so that you can stay in the same environment as you work in these different content solutions. So that's really all. I wanted to make sure that people understood where IBM plays in this very important space. And I know we have some questions, so let's go back to you, John, and hear if we can get a couple of them in before the top of the hour.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, David. And there's a couple teed up here. We're going to continue this conversation in the AIM community. So some of these questions that we don't quite get to, then we'll try to tackle them there. So let's just cover a couple of these things. And one I think is kind of an interesting one to start with, which is, George, you used the term redheaded stepchild for ECM, and why do you think that is?
Because people are equating ECM with dusty file cabinets behind the curtain, when in fact it's a strategic technology that will drive their organization and processes.
And Paul, do you think that would you share in that characterization? Is that kind of a typical in your organization too?
Yeah, I agree 100%. But I think that part of the problem is that we're so caught in the moment and so caught in the future that we forget that all of that data that's sitting back there is really the historical treasure trove that is just waiting to be opened. And if we were to put a little more attention looking back on that and recognize that, hey, wait a minute here, there are all kinds of opportunities. Whether in my business it's how did patients react to a certain set of medications and all of the research opportunities that are available there. I think once we start thinking more and more along the lines that it's not the here and now, it's not the future, but we also bring along with us the past, and that past lives within our ECM.
Here's a question from somebody that is just starting out, and they said, I struggle with getting senior leadership concerned about records management and document issues. They choose to run at risk, basically. And I'm meeting with them next week to try to get funding for a ECM project. Any words of wisdom, any way that I should approach this?
What is the cost of no?
This requires you to go way back to when you started.
What is the cost now not to have records management? What's the risk exposure?
I think my answer to that question would be, George, what you were talking about earlier is that this is a technology to drive a business application, and that you have to understand the nuts and bolts and metrics of the business application in order to be smart about content management.
Yeah, you always got to pitch the solution to a problem. So define the problem and then show how ECM can solve it.
Paul, do you have any take on that?
Well, I do. It's not something that we worry about too much in the patient care world because we don't really get rid of anything. But over and over again, we're reminded that there is a life expectancy of pieces of data, and there is a significant cost and a risk in keeping data beyond the legal need to keep it. For example, billing information, we only have to keep it 5, 6, 7, 10 years. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it's a specific amount of time. And if you keep that data longer than you have to, not only do you have the cost of storing it, but you have the added risk that something is going to be found in there that might be unpleasant. So we've worked on several initiatives in order to work with senior management in order to help them understand that risk is in fact a 4-letter word and one that they have to assist us in managing.
Well, I think we're at the point where we're just about out of time, and so as we go through this, I just wanted to leave you with a couple of resources that you might want to think about. The first one is an ebook that we did, which was called The Next Wave, and moving from enterprise content management to intelligent information management. And so I'd advise you to take a look at that and let us know what you think. It's basically, our stab, kind of my stab at talking about this question of, why does the term ECM seem to be a little bit dated, and yet what people are doing with content is at the very heart of what organizations are all about. So I would urge you to take a look at that. Also, we have a special unlimited training offer for those of you that haven't participated in our training program in the past. This is a really, really interesting deal, and I would urge you to take a look at it. It only goes through August 25th. And then the last thing is I just wanted to make sure that we thank our speakers. I'd like to thank Jenson and Paul and George and David for being here with us. We really appreciate your insights and your experience. And I'd like to give each of you just 15 seconds to give one parting word to the audience. And if you want to pass, that's okay. So let's start. David, one parting word.
No, I want the experts. I want to hear from them. Nobody wants to hear from me.
Paul, you go.
We're only at the beginning. I think it's going to become a much more enjoyable and exciting ride as we continue on.
Jenson.
I would say, as I teach my students in SUNY Albany, I say data is the king. I'm going to say content is the king. Don't ignore it.
George.
John, I want to thank you and AIM. When I started this journey long ago, it was AIM that helped me understand what this was and what the capabilities are. And echoing everybody's thoughts, we're just starting, but I wouldn't be here without you and AIM.
Well, thank you, George. That's very kind of you. I really do appreciate that. And I will leave it at that because that made my day. So thank you very much, George, and thank you, everybody, for that. And thanks for the attendees for being here. And we will continue the conversation on the AIM community site, so make sure you check that out. And until next time, thank you, IBM, for sponsoring, and thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next time.